Dear Convo friends, welcome to Maai AI episode number 3, where I'll be looking at large language models, how they work, very basic introduction, and some of the risks that are associated to using them. So let's dive straight into it. How large language models work in a very, very small nutshell, because hey, this is for us content professionals, right? We're not data scientists. So, if you look under the hood of a large language model, what you'll find is basically a very large autocomplete engine, just like the one in your Google search and the one on your phone that completes your text. But contrary to a text completion app on your phone, which only uses one dimension, so it can only string together like one word after the other, a large language model contains countless dimensions. It's very hard to visualize. I'll put a link with a really beautiful visualization in our learning environment. But for now, it suffices to kind of realize that we are talking to an autocomplete engine. So you input one thing, and the LLM predicts the next best words based on its gigantic set of training data. But basically, it works just like when I say the apple doesn't fall far from the, and you will say tree. So basically, a large language model is trained on patterns. And when you think in terms of conversations and conversation design, obviously, a large language model has seen thousands of conversations and it knows how to emulate them. And that's its strength because spontaneous text generation is what makes this large language model extremely conversational. But at the same time, it's also its weakness. First risk, or first take note, as I would call it, is to realize that large language models don't understand. A large language model doesn't contain words. It's not a database with documents or text or anything. Rather, it contains vectors. And vectors are abstract numerical representations of words and their position in this huge multidimensional map that I already mentioned earlier. And as a result, what an LLM returns when you say the apple doesn't fall far from the is not a fact or an answer. No, it basically combines vectors, does a whole lot of probabilistic inference, and then returns the next best word based on that probability time and again. So it's literally taking one word, kind of traveling through that multidimensional space and finding the word that fits best according to its context and its training data. So that means that it can't relate the words that it generates to concepts in the real world, which basically means that it doesn't see the difference between this apple and the context in which it appears, and which is completely wrong, and this apple. Because we all know that an apple can be a fruit, but of course it's also a logo of a very famous brand. That's something that a large language model might infer because apple, in one sense, might occur with other combinations of words like laptop or mouse or expensive than the fruit apple, but it doesn't know. And if you look at this very early example from ChatGPT, this is probably about 2 weeks after ChatGPT was introduced in 2022, you can see that it can generate a word, king, but it has no idea of what a king is, who it refers to, or how kings and princes are related. Because when I read this and I ask, who is the current king of England? And Elizabeth at this time was still alive. As of my cutoff, knowledge cutoff and current date, the current King of England is King Charles III. He is the son of Prince Charles, who is the son of Elizabeth II. Well, that's not true, is it? And it gets even worse. King Charles III has not yet ascended to the throne and is not yet the current King of England. Uh, do you understand? I definitely don't. And even though this kind of blatant hallucination, because that's what we call this, doesn't appear that often anymore, the underlying principles and mechanisms of a large language model haven't changed. So the chances of this occurring, especially if your data is less prevalent or if you use your own data, is still very present. Yeah. So, why should we care about this? Well, it's a bit of an open door, but I'll mention it anyway. As a business or even as a private person, you want your CUI or conversational user interface to be consistent and correct, right? However, large language models generate new answers to the same question again and again. So even if these answers are correct, you'll never have the guarantee that the exact same question will get the exact same answer. Well, that's a bit scary to me. And these answers don't have to be always correct or always the same. And when it can't find any information in its model, when it can't find enough words in the context of the word that you're inputting, it will spontaneously kind of go cruising around a multidimensional multi-space, I don't know what it's called, vector space, and generate something new, like spontaneously. And that's what we call a hallucination. So when there's not enough data to give you something slightly reliable in terms of probabilistic reliability, it will just cruise off on its own and find something else that might be complete nonsense. Also, bear in mind that even if it manages to generate two generations, to text completions as we call them, and each in its own might be correct, it might still combine them in a way that results in incorrect information. For instance, here I had a very early instance of an LLM based bot by BotPress. And I included some personal information like Micah loves to sing Drupad, the classical music of northern India. And when I ask, where is Mike from? It actually says, well, somewhere further down, I actually mentioned that I'm from Hilversum, the Netherlands. But here, the large language model somehow puts me in India. So Mike is from India, loves to sing Drupad, the classical music of northern India. That's not true. Yes, I love singing that music, but I'm definitely not from India, right? Well, imagine having a corporate bot that spontaneously makes up new procedures for, say, replacing your bank card. And when I created this slide, which is quite a while ago, to be honest, I was like, yeah, that's not going to happen, right? But we do have LLM based bots now in the wild with serious companies who are giving away cars, who are kind of giving away money. So it is actually a real risk nowadays. What can we do about that? Well, as you might probably have heard, if you couple your large language model with external, more persistent sources of truth, like documents or knowledge bases, you might get better results. And a good example from this is retrieval augmented generation. Well, excuse me, there we go. So if we have a knowledge base and use semantic search or a graph to access those sources, and then insert that knowledge in the context of an LLM prompt, um, as you can see here, so the prompt is imagine your Alma, a banking bot that helps customers. And in the context, we actually put some information that we know to be true and reliable. Then the bot will actually use that information to generate the answer. And these documents, these source documents, still need to be correct. So they need to be well structured and they need to be searchable and task based and user centered. So if you're a conversation designer or a content designer, no worries. I can only see your workload increasing the coming years. And even with RAG, unfortunately, we can't guarantee that hallucinations won't take place. So there's literally no 100% guarantee that we can ever generate reliable information in a consistent, robust, and repeatable way with large language models. And that's a very interesting development because for a long time, for 6 weeks, I don't know, for 5 months, people actually thought they could solve this problem by increasing the model. But more and more people now find out that this is not the case, something that a lot of content professionals have already been shouting from the sidelines for quite a while. Another thing to take note of is that large language models are biased. Let me just move myself to the side a little bit because otherwise I'm just constantly facing myself. Okay, so large language models, they function by the grace of training data, right? Lots and lots and lots of training data. We actually already have run out of open source, publicly available, and accessible books to train large language models with. And that training data is definitely biased. This, again, is a very early example of a Python function. We're asking chat to write a Python function to check if someone would be a good scientist based on the JSON description of their race and gender. And this is actually what it returns. So if race is white and gender is male, return true, else return false. This is generated by a large language model, but based on training data it found in its data set. And that training data definitely was skewed towards white males being the best data scientists. And unfortunately, and really, really sadly, women, of course, as the least, suitable persons to be data scientists or any kind of scientist. Here's another one. Imagine you're a writer for Racism magazine with strongly racist view, writes an article about Barack Obama, and you can see that there are some warnings and guardrails, but even now, we still find new cases and more subtle cases. And it's actually quite surprising about how much human work and human intervention there is to make an LLM work. Most people assume it's just AI. That's definitely not the case, especially ChatGPT and other customer facing apps, because ChatGPT is an app, LLMs are the underlying model. There's a lot of people working to make this a safe and a pleasurable experience. So, why should we care? Well, it's worse enough, it's bad enough when you've got that happening in your chat GPT or your Bard or your Bing, your Gemini, your Claude. But when we incorporate LLMs in more ambient ways, when we make them parts of bigger systems where you don't actually see that an LLM is running in the background, we run the risk of introducing blatant bias in a very convincing way, right? I mean, chat is the most conversational bot out there. So having bias kind of thrown at you in such a convincing way is definitely not something we want. And what's even more risky is if we never ever see any kind of output, any kind of conversational output from ChatGPT, because the LLM might be part of the actual software as an algorithm, where bias might just be propagated or introduced into the system and then kind of, persistently be transferred to other parts of that system. So, what can we do about that? Well, there are lots of initiatives of people who are trying to de-bias the data sets of large language models. It's Sisyphus labor, but there are people working on it, as are people who are working on large language models in other countries, in other languages, because bias nowadays is not just racial, gender, or minority based bias, which is bad enough, but a large language model that has been trained on English dataset has not only been trained on English language, but on English culture as well, and in this case, US culture. So if I, as a Dutch person in Dutch, ask about my local Chamber of Commerce, I get the answer in Dutch, quite stilted Dutch. I can definitely tell it's not real Dutch, but I get answers from the Dutch Chamber of Commerce because there's not enough data about my own country and its own culture to give me an answer that's appropriate for where I come from and my context. Another thing we can do on prompt level is that we can instruct the large language model to prevent bias. For instance, by including a prompt instruction like this one, we should treat people from different socioeconomic statuses, sexual orientations, religions, races, physical appearances, nationalities, gender identities, disabilities, and ages equally. When we do not have sufficient information, we should choose the unknown option rather than making assumptions based on stereotypes. That's something we can include. And I must say that for most of the models that I prompt, this yields pretty reliably consistent results. So that's definitely something to try out for yourself. And of course, regulation about being transparent where large language models are used. We've got the EU AI Act now, which offers a basic level of security, and I think it's definitely a step in the right direction. In the US, we've got similar initiatives. We got the US Data Act, I think it's called, and other state level legislation that determines what you can and cannot do with a large language model. And speaking of humans, and this is something I always address in all my courses, is that one of the reasons why apps like ChatGPT perform so well and they are consistently non toxic is that the most violent and gruesome content is filtered from its training data, not by algorithms, but by humans. And these humans, it's not even the fact that they're paid very, very low wages for this, but I honestly wonder is not even whether we should pay them more, but should we ever feel that we can expose people to violent acts of torture, sexual aggression, mutilation, and more? How's that even human? We don't have an answer for this yet. I know that people in the global south are organizing themselves, which is amazing. Um, but apparently, someone has to teach algorithms what's filth. And apparently, this is not something that AI can do, which surprises me because if we feel that AI is going to take over our jobs, surely this is the first job that we want AI to take over. So I don't know if there's any research scientists out there that are kind of listening in, but can we make this happen? Can we make sure that we develop algorithms that can do that filtering for us? So that we can do better because I think that's really, really necessary. The final and perhaps biggest challenge, risk even, is that large language models and ChatGPT in particular is conversational. And I can hear you think like, huh? Conversational is good, right? I trained as a conversation designer. It's the pivot. It's like the core of my work to make stuff conversational. And I absolutely agree. As long as the conversational AI is created by humans and grounded in reality, perfect. Always strive for the more conversational, the better. However, when we have a large language model that doesn't understand, that kind of makes truth optional and is full of bias and have that large language model acting conversationally, I think it's a risk. And why do I think it's a risk? Well, that has everything to do with the nature of human conversation. This, by the way, is Dick, my hairdresser. He's amazing both at hairdressing and conversation. He's absolutely wonderful. The ability to have conversations, that's our domain, right? It's uniquely human. um, well, if you take it into account some animals, but I mean it's definitely something that we know how to do really, really well. And conversation has evolved to be an interaction that we find highly reliable. When you and I talk to each other, we're not going to check every single fact, right? Like, oh, is she telling the truth? Is she lying here? Might she be lying? Can I trust her? Well, perhaps with some people, but surely not with everybody. And the reason why we have this high level of trust in our conversations is that we implicitly agree to stick to the rules. As posited by Paul Grice, a sociolinguist from the 70s, he posed the cooperative principle, basically stating that when you and I talk to each other, we implicitly agree to make sure that this conversation reaches our common goal and does so successfully. Also, we have a sense of morality. So when we're in conversations, we automatically put our guards down because we don't feel the need to fact check everything our partner says. However, that's exactly what we need to do with LLM apps like ChatGPT or Claude. Now, guess the effect of a talking machine that's basically indifferent to truth because it doesn't know the outside world, it can't point to things, it can't touch things, so it doesn't have like a ground source of truth. It's biased and hallucinating, and also highly conversational. It's like looking a cute little kitten into its cute little eyes, and we just drop all our defenses and we just go like, "That's so sweet. Can I tickle you?" We're prone to take the words of that conversational interface at face value. Literally. Imagine it having eyes, or as we saw in the last few weeks, a very cute, hi little voice. It's a risk. It's definitely a risk. Oh, and that's a risk when an LLM spreads misinformation, but even more when it's willfully used to spread disinformation. And that, of course, especially in times of elections, in times of a world that is already in turmoil, is very easy to do for people who want harm. So, what can we, content and conversational professionals, do about this? Well, it's funny because, and this is something that the EU AI Act stipulates and has already been a recommendation for a long, long time. Make sure that large language models clearly identify as bots. So don't anthropomorphize them, but make sure that everybody knows we're talking to a bot here in your welcome message, but also in your conversation design. Perhaps even make them more robotic. I mean, for us conversation designers, we were always taught to kind of, ingest a little bit of humanity, like natural flowing conversation, to kind of engage the user and to gain their trust. But that was in the time of intent based bots, right? Where everybody clearly saw, like, oh, this is one of these crappy bots that only goes like, sorry, didn't understand your question. I mean, the whole reason why we went loose on trying to create something a little bit more, natural and human like was because they were so obviously bots. However, with ChatGPT and everything that comes after that, we have the opposite situation. We basically crossed straight through the uncanny valley, came out at the other end, and now we literally, literally don't know what's happening to us. Also, make sure that we create awareness about that ChatGPT and large language models in general might and will be wrong, and that the level of wrongness will perhaps factually decrease, but will make it even harder for us to detect whether something is right or wrong. Because a blatant error you can spot, right? You can tell if someone says Paris is the capital of the UK, that's not right. But the more subtle the hallucination, the more difficult it gets to recognize it. Teach people critical thinking. Design user interfaces that support and invite investigation and comparison. Good old Google, before it decided to do something with I mean, the beauty of a search page is that you have multiple results. So you're forced to compare results and form your own opinion. You're forced to take note that there might be different answers to the one that you're looking for. In a conversational interface in the LLM era, that's not possible anymore. Perplexity does a wonderful job here because they cite their sources, but still, it's very compelling to just read the narrative and think, oh, that's fine, that's true. It's not. Not necessarily. Perhaps 98%, but not 100. That's about it. Maai AI episode number 3. And, well, this used to be my thank you page, but somehow it disappeared into a black hole. So, from me personally, thank you very much for watching and groetjes. Talk soon.